Wavelength.
Mental illness doesn't have to be a life sentence.
Alcohol addiction, abuse, misuse is the same all over the globe.
Sparking the combos about Adelaide.
So it made me feel very confident that if we did have it in the state, we were going to know about it.
You should be having.
There'll be guys that are trained, but they don't feel like they're good enough to take their shirt off.
Almost everyone is a culprit of doom scrolling. Anyone who has a mobile phone.
On Fresh 92.7.
Welcome to Wavelength, sparking the conversations about Adelaide you should be having. I'm your host, David, and tonight I am joined by Ash. How are you doing, man? Welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much. It's so great to be back in the studio again.
Yes.
I was here a couple of weeks ago and I'm back again and I'm really enjoying it. I love hosting, David. And when you put the call out, I was like, oh, yay.
Of course I will. No, it's always good to have you here. We've got a cracker of a show tonight, actually.
Yeah, we do. Tonight on Wavelength, we're asking how prepared are we here in Australia for more natural disasters? We've recently been through two once-in-a-century catastrophes over the last year and a bit. So what are we doing to get ready for the next one?
That's right. Wavelength is also going to explain the India travel ban and the COVID-19 situation over there. Next, we're introducing you to Adelaide's freshest queer nightclub. You're listening to Fresh.
Wavelength.
Welcome back to Wavelength, sparking the convos about Adelaide you should be having. We hope you're having a brilliant Monday. So, Aj, this week you got to sit down with the owners of My Lover Cindy, Adelaide's latest queer bar. I can imagine the interview was heaps of fun. Tell us a bit about the new joint.
Yeah, so I sat down and I spoke with Kate over the phone. Mm-hmm. She's really, really upbeat, really lively. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to go to their opening because their opening up was on the 1st. And
it was the other week, right?
Yeah, and I was feeling a little bit sick the week before. Whilst I'd gotten over my cold, I was still feeling really lethargic, so I wasn't actually able to go out. But if you saw their socials, it was insane. Like the line went out the door, down the alleyway. So I probably wouldn't have been able to get in regardless.
Dude, I tried to go myself and my friend was in the line and she's like, I've been here for an hour. And I'm like, no way.
So I have to go when the line isn't that long, which is a really kind of harsh thing to say, I think. I'm just like, I want you guys to be doing well, but not so well that I can't make it in.
Yeah, literally. Well, let's hear this interview right now. You're listening to Fresh.
Wavelength on Fresh 92.7.
I don't know about the folks who are listening in today, but I love heading out to the pub. However, there are some who find it really, really hard because the venue isn't very inclusive. My Lover Cindy has just opened their doors and they had a massive opening weekend. They are leading the way when it comes to being a queer space as well as being disabled friendly. I sat down with the owner and founder, Kate, who opened the place up with her partner, Rachel, to have a chat about My Lover Cindy. Kate, can you just tell me about My Lover Cindy and how this whole thing came about?
Absolutely. So My Lover Cindy was sort of born from my partner, Rachel, and I just being frustrated at the lack of accessible and inclusive queer venues in Adelaide and really just wanting a space that recognises that not everyone drinks when they go out, but people still want to go out and have a party, have a dance, maybe have a sit down and chat with some friends.
Now, I understand as well, comes to disability inclusivity, you guys are sort of leading the way in a lot of ways. What can you tell me about some of the protocols you've put in place so that it's more inclusive to people who are living with a disability?
Sure. Well, I think just to clarify as well that we want to be really clear that, you know, our venue isn't perfect and we still have a way to go and we're still learning and trying to make things as accessible as possible. But for us at the moment, we have an accessible toilet. We've done things like put our soap dispenser and hand towel lower down so that patrons who are using a mobility aid can access it better. We don't have any steps leading into the venue, and we've actually got a priority access space at the bar because we recognise that our physical bar is actually quite high, and so people with mobility aids are not able to actually get up close to the bar. So instead we've cordoned off an area at the bar so that people can actually get through to buy a drink.
Now, you guys opened over the weekend, over the 1st and the 2nd. How was opening?
It was hectic. We actually had a line that stemmed out of our venue, down our laneway and all the way to the end of the street at one point, which was just not something that we imagined would happen. And so we've had a lot of really great feedback, and we've had some feedback about stuff that we need to work on and keep improving. And yeah, we just had an absolute jam-packed weekend. It was incredible to see everyone out
Now, when it comes to safe queer spaces for people who have different sexual orientations or who are gender diverse, what needs to be done and why is it important that those spaces exist?
I think it's really important to have queer spaces that are inclusive of the full range of our queer communities. So people who do have disabilities and people who are not white, people of colour, people with differing needs and even different entertainment kind of options. Because I think there's this kind of misperception that queer community is a monolith and that all we like to do is go out and drink a lot of alcohol and watch drag. And, you know, that is a big part of queer culture, but also queer culture is diverse. So we just want to add something to the scene in Adelaide, I guess.
Why don't you tell me about the name? Because that really piques my interest. How you sort of came, I love bars and pubs, and it always intrigues me how their names come about. And there's usually quite an interesting story. Why don't you tell me a little bit about the name My Lover Cindy?
Sure. So the name refers to a character in this notorious lesbian sitcom called The L Word. There's a character in there who is always referred to by her partner as My Lover Cindy rather than her full name, and she sort of gets up the guts to leave her partner at some point and uses her full name again without being, you know, just kind of being delegated to someone being someone's lover. But we also really wanted to include the word love in our name because we just want this space to be full of love for our community. And the other thing is that there is this history of queer bars, gay bars in particular, being named after women in the States, but also closer to home here in Adelaide. We've historically had gay bars that have been named women's names. So we wanted to kind of, pay tribute to that history as well.
Wavelength, sparking the convos about Adelaide you should be having on Fresh 92.7.
That right there was Arj chatting with one of the owners of My Lover Cindy, called Kate. One of Adelaide's newest queer bars, if you didn't catch that from the interview, but it's so exciting. I really, really love that they're trying their hardest, their very hardest, and doing a really good job at it, putting a lot of thought into being inclusive, not just to queer people, but to disabled people too.
Yeah, no, I think it's that extra step that kind of sets them apart a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of those things where it's kind of bad that we don't immediately think about the needs of others when we set up these spaces. So even things like, oh yeah, I wouldn't think about how someone who's using a wheelchair might not be able to order a drink easily at a bar because the bar top is so high,
right.
And the bartender wouldn't see them because when it's a packed out venue, they're just going, oh yeah, this person, and the queue for the bar is always kind of a loose unit.
You just have to grab someone's eyes.
Yeah, right. And so not having that space there, it would be really difficult for them to get to the front of the line and then get the attention of the bartender and then actually get their goddamn drink.
Totally.
So it's really nice that, My Lover Cindy's and the owners there have thought, yeah, okay, we'll put a separate space here, or we'll lower the taps and lower the soap dispenser so that they can easily sort of access, hand hygiene and things like that.
Things that you and I take for granted every day.
Exactly, because it's one of those things where because it doesn't affect you, you don't think about it.
Yeah.
Right? And like Kate herself said, they're still learning, they're still growing, but at least they're taking that step.
At least they're trying.
Yeah, that's the thing. And I think,
you got to give them points for that. The best thing is no judgment.
Yes.
You'll always, if you're not queer, I'm sure My Lover Cindy will open you with wide arms. If you're respectful, they'll respect you. And that's how it goes.
Yeah, it's a very simple sort of attitude, isn't it? And,
totally.
Give respect, get respect.
That's it. Anyway, coming up after the break, we'll be cracking into our main story of the evening about whether Australia is prepared for the next major natural disaster. You're listening to Wavelength on Fresh 92.7.
Wavelength.
Welcome back to Wavelength with David and Arj tonight, sparking the convos about Adelaide you should be having. So over the past couple of years, the world has been hit by increasingly ferocious natural disasters. Floods, earthquakes, droughts and bushfires. We've seen some of the worst of those pretty recently, especially here in Australia. We've had 2 once-in-a-century natural disasters, basically just 1 year apart. So here at Wavelength, we wanted to know, is Australia actually prepared for more? To find out, Amila spoke with Professor Lesley Hughes, who teaches biology at Macquarie University and is also a councillor for the Climate Change Council of Australia.
Wavelength on Fresh 92.7.
With Australia still recovering from the Black Summer fires and more recently the Eastern Australian floods, it begs the question of whether this will keep happening and whether we're prepared for it. To better understand how climate change impacts natural disasters and what we can expect for the future, I talked to Professor Lesley Hughes, who teaches biology at Macquarie University and is also a councillor for the Climate Council of Australia.
Well, many of our disasters are becoming rather unnatural, so I think the use of the term natural disasters has probably had its day. So we've known for several decades that as the world heats up, the sorts of extreme events that really cause impacts, things like bushfires, floods, heat waves, droughts, are increasing in both severity and intensity. So what we are seeing now and have been seeing for quite a while and will continue to see accelerate in the future are these so-called natural disasters increasing.
Would you say they increase in frequency as well? There were some concerns about the way Gladys Berejiklian talked about the floods and how it was in a 1 in 50-year event. Would you still say that's accurate?
No, it's not accurate because these disasters are occurring more frequently. So what was perhaps used to be a 1 in 50-year or 1 in 100-year event might be becoming a 1 in 5-year or a 1 in 2-year event, or maybe in the future might be expected almost every year. So I think those sorts of descriptions of frequency are becoming increasingly out of date.
Would you say that the Australian government's pledge in the Paris deal adequately addresses some of the issues regarding climate change?
No, the Australian government's pledge of a 26 to 28% greenhouse gas emissions reduction by 2030 compared to 2005 is one of the weakest in the world. It's certainly the weakest in the OECD. It's absolutely not adequate to do our fair share of emissions reduction to meet the Paris climate targets.
Well, what kind of changes do you think we have to see to prepare for things like natural disasters?
Well, we have to do two things. We have to be better prepared on the ground, so we need to be putting more resources into emergency services personnel and equipment and infrastructure and have better plans in place so that we can prepare for things in advance rather than be relatively unprepared and have to spend a lot of money afterwards mopping up the results. But we also, even more importantly, have to address the root cause of the climate change problem, and that is to do our bit in terms of emissions reduction, move away from using fossil fuels as rapidly as possible and put all sorts of other sustainable measures in place to make the climate of the world in the second half of this century something that's livable.
In the Royal Commission into National Natural Disaster Arrangements, the reference to the phrase climate change is made 67 times. The report states warming beyond the next 20 to 30 years is largely dependent on the trajectory of greenhouse gas emissions. In the government's response to the recommendations outlined in the report, it acknowledged that natural disasters will become more frequent and intense due to the climate, but does not elaborate on it any further. The response also makes no acknowledgement of greenhouse gas emissions. Well, the government is planning to introduce the National Resilience Relief and Recovery Agency to better prepare for natural disasters. But in their report and their response to the recommendations, they never mention climate change. Would you say this is a problem?
It's an enormous problem. I mean, I'm all for resources going into an agency to build resilience and to be better prepared and to reduce the impacts of inevitable climate-related disasters. But to just not mention climate change at all is absolutely par for the course with this government that's been putting their heads collectively in the sand on this for more than a decade now.
How does the future of Australia look when it comes to the weather and natural disasters?
We're seeing, we've got more than double the number of extreme hot days now than we had three decades ago. We're seeing unprecedented bushfires like in Black Summer. We're seeing, in some cases, unprecedented intensity of flooding. All of these things we should expect to see more often. We have most of our population and expensive infrastructure along the coastline, which of course is subject to sea level rise, which in turn exacerbates the impact of storm surges. And, we've certainly seen in the last few years suburbs in Sydney that have lost houses and swimming pools and backyards, etc., to the impacts of coastal erosion as a result. So absolutely, we cannot expect the future to be the same as the past. The future is changing very rapidly all the time.
Wavelength, sparking the convos about Adelaide you should be having on Fresh 92.7.
Welcome back to Wavelength. We'll be getting back into our story about whether we're prepared for the next natural disaster here in Australia soon, but now we're cracking into our weekly segment where Hamish explains what the hell has happened this week.
What the hell is going on this week? Wavelength on Fresh 92.7.
A lot of news to get through this week, like Facebook upholding their ban against Donald Trump.
That's good.
And the worsening crisis in India.
That's bad.
So let's cut through it like a day-old roast chicken. Addressing the situation in India, Prime Minister Scott Morrison spent another week in the headlines, facing increasing criticism for his ban on repatriated flights from the COVID-ravaged nation, which he predictably backflipped on by the end of the week. I mean, when Andrew Bolt is calling you racist, well, it's probably time to admit you've screwed up. Mega philanthropists and possible reptilians Bill and Melinda Gates announced their divorce after 27 years together this week, which had lawyers the world over drooling into their lapels. Early reports have emerged that the divorce hasn't been a friendly split, and with $168 billion to divide, who would have guessed? A man who was almost killed by a great white shark in Port Lincoln won the right to keep the tooth that the smooth-skinned beast left in his surfboard on the exemption that he not make it into one of those tacky shark tooth necklaces. You just know that's what he had planned. Our ongoing grey war with China, which currently holds the record for the most boring war ever, reached new heights this week when the Asian superpower officially cut off all diplomatic communication with Australia. Which sounds bad, but is effectively just the same as finally unfriending that one guy on Facebook you met at a rave 4 years ago and haven't spoken to since. Finally, fallen sports star Jared Hayne was officially sentenced to 5 years and 9 months in prison for raping a woman back in 2018, and all I have to say about that is good. And that's what the hell has been going on this week.
Wavelength, sparking the convos about Adelaide you should be having on Fresh 92.7.
Welcome back to Wavelength. Before the break, we heard from Lesley Hughes from Macquarie University and the Climate Change Council of Australia about whether Australia is prepared for another catastrophic natural disaster. But what's the government already doing about it? Amila jumped on the phone with the Federal Minister in charge of Emergency Management, David Littleproud, to find out.
Wavelength on Fresh 92.7.
By July, the government will have established a National Resilience Relief and Recovery Agency. The creation of this agency is in response to the recommendations from the Royal Commission into Natural Disasters. To understand what role it will play to keep Aussies safe, I had a chat with the Minister for Agriculture, Drought and Emergency Management, David Littleproud.
Well, this is a recommendation from the Royal Commission into Natural Disasters to have a national agency that is a multi-disaster. So that's ranging from drought to cyclones to fire and everything else in between. And what that means is that we have a more coordinated and agile approach to disasters and actually dealing with them, particularly in terms of the recovery, but also working through making sure we're building resilience between one disaster and the next to make sure that our communities are stronger and more prepared between disasters.
So you mentioned that it's kind of bringing in the flood and the bushfire agencies. What role will they have in this new effort?
Well, they'll continue on exactly what they're doing now. At the moment, we have two agencies. We have a Drought and North West Queensland Flood Agency and we have a Bushfire Agency. What we're doing is bringing them into one agency to make sure there's coordination, because there's even been crossover between drought and bushfire, the flood and drought and flood and fire. So we want to make sure that it's consistent no matter the disaster, that the people on the ground who are impacted know what's coming. There's consistency, but there's also, more importantly, there'll be people on the ground to be at the kitchen table, to be at town halls, to be able to support the community to rebuild.
So you mentioned that there was a Royal Commission. In the government's response to the Royal Commission into national natural disaster arrangements, the words climate change were never mentioned. Is this factor being ignored when assessing the risk of natural disasters?
Well, that's a question for the commissioners. That's what the Royal Commission commissioners put in terms of the report. We actually take it very seriously, and we continue to, and we'll make sure that we understand that's part of the planning, as it is every year. It's part of normal business. And in fact, I've got to say that the Fire and Emergency Service Commissioners from around the country, I should say, every year meticulously plan for a changing climate. We get those conditions. They were prepared for last year's Black Summer. They predicted it, understood it, and we had everything we possibly could ready for it. This year, again, we saw that we were going to go to a La Nina event, and so they were prepared and ready for the flooding event. So the science and what we're trying to do, and that's why we've created CASA, which is a climate agency that will bring together the best science from not only BOM but CSIRO, Geoscience Australia, with the Australian Bureau of Statistics to make sure that we can tell now that if a cyclone is about to come across the coast of Australia, we'll be able to tell the number of people who live in a house that is built before 1983, so that we understand the resources required to support them, and making sure, as part of the package that we announced today, the $600 million, $200 million of that will go to households, up to $30,000 a household, to do renovations to prepare their houses for more turbulent weather into the future.
Since you mentioned turbulent weather, is there a concern that natural disasters will become more frequent and severe for Australians?
Well, yes. In fact, there are statistics of this that has already been assessed through a report that shows that natural disasters at the moment cost us around $18 billion. We think by 2050, with the consistency of them coming and the scale of them, it'll cost the economy around $39 billion. And so that's why the $600 million that we're putting out in not only just household mitigation works, but also community mitigation works will help to build that resilience and build that strength in our communities to prepare for these disasters as they come in. So the money we spend now is an investment to reduce that overall money in the future.
Are there any major prevention tactics that are being implemented to try and reduce any risk of natural disaster?
We're putting $88 million into research. So that is not just bringing together the climate research we have, but also the techniques that are required to support our firefighters on the ground, as well as aerial assets and what is the best mix of aerial assets that are required. So we're working through in making sure that we have the cutting edge research for that in terms of the delivery of making sure that we're prepared into the future.
Why do you think in the government's response to the Royal Commission there wasn't any mention of climate change?
Well, it's business as usual. I don't think it needs to become a religion. It needs to have practical solutions to mitigate and to actually respond to. And that's why we put cold hard cash into it. I think everyone wants to get caught on the religion rather than the practical solutions of keeping people safe. That's what we're doing. If people want to talk about the religion, good luck to them. We'd rather work on the practical outcomes that will keep people safe and get them prepared into the future.
Wavelength, sparking the convos about Adelaide you should be having on Fresh 92.7.
That was Amila speaking with Federal MP David Littleproud about what the government is doing to prepare us for the next natural disaster. Thanks for that, Amila. We've still got plenty of Wavelength left for you guys tonight, though, so stay tuned. You're listening to Fresh.
Wavelength.
Welcome back to Wavelength, sparking the convos about Adelaide you should be having.
Right now, we've got our weekly segment called Wavelength Explains. The COVID-19 situation in India isn't getting any better. In fact, it's the worst we've seen during this entire pandemic, and that's despite the vaccine being rolled out in the nation.
This week, Amila explains what's happened this week in India and the controversial travel ban.
Wavelength Explains on Fresh 92.7.
Enacted by Greg Hunt on April 30, the India travel ban has put Australia in an uncomfortable position on the world stage. More than 9,000 Australians have remained trapped in India by the travel ban. Many left for India before the crisis unfolded on compassionate grounds so they could visit sick and dying relatives. Critics argue that the ban was extreme and disproportionate to the health risks. Under these restrictions, anyone who has been in India within 14 days could face 5 years in prison or a fine of up to $66,000. Now the government has announced that the ban will not be extended beyond May 15, with at least 6 flights planned as soon as the ban is lifted. The federal government was planning to accept 3 flights, but New South Wales, Victoria and Queensland expressed willingness to take on additional flights so more Aussies could return home. These flights will focus on the 900 Aussies in India who have been classed as vulnerable. And although the ban will end in 5 days, it's still being challenged in federal court by Gary Newman. His lawyers will argue that Hunt's emergency declaration under the Biosecurity Act is invalid on constitutional grounds. It will be up to the government to prove that the measures were not discriminatory and were the only suitable way of dealing with a threat to public health.
Wavelength, sparking the convos about Adelaide you should be having on Fresh 92.7.
That there was Miller explaining the COVID situation in India. Yes, it's really upsetting. Genuinely is really upsetting. But Arj, I'm interested in asking, what do you make of the travel ban?
I think it's a tough situation that the government's been put in.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's a racial-based policy.
Mm-hmm.
I know Australia does make a lot of those, so it's very easy to be like, they're being racist. Like, well, maybe not this time. But I think it was a really, really harsh sort of policy in line that they took. And there were definitely other options that they could have
Surely there were other ways they could have done it.
Stick them on Christmas Island.
Right.
What is it, 2-3 weeks and then she'll be right. Like, we kept refugees there for 5-6 years. What do we need? A couple of swags, beans, some canned tuna, some instant noodles. You're laughing. Coffee.
Some instant coffee. Yep.
Yeah. Bushels tea.
Yeah. Some Lipton. Couple of tea bags.
Maybe a bit of Milo.
Gosh, come on.
Yeah.
That's a bit much. That's that's a bit of a luxury.
Oh, right. Yeah. My bad. But it'll be like high school camp.
Yeah, just chuck a couple of old CRTVs in there. maybe hook up the Foxtel.
Yeah. We'll add that dodgy TV with the VCR player and be like, guys, we're gonna watch School of Rock.
Come on, we're chucking Shrek on today.
Yes. Yeah. Shrek 1, Shrek 2, back to back, double feature,
marathon. You couldn't get any better than that.
Exactly right. That option was lying in wait. I mean, I'm sure there's still a Blockbuster somewhere that you can get the VCR copy.
In all seriousness, it is an awful situation.
Oh, it's terrible.
But us here, we like to make things a bit lighter for you. You're listening to Fresh 92.7.
Wavelength.
Welcome back to Wavelength, sparking the convos about Adelaide you should be having.
Right now, we've got our favourite weekly segment called Heaps Good News. This week, Jared has got the goods for us.
I know there's gonna be
Heaps Good News on Wavelength.
Hi everyone, I'm Jared McLaughlin with another helping of Heaps Good News for you all to devour. Hannah Gadsby, who tore many heartstrings worldwide with her widely acclaimed stand-up comedy shows Nanette and Douglas, recently announced her nuptials with New York-based producer Jenna Sharmas on her Twitter account. Gadsby told her fans that she was chuffed and feeling very positive about it, while also thanking those who voted yes for marriage equality in Australia, which was legalised in 2017. Surprisingly, Sharmas was referenced during an interview promoting Douglas, which centred heavily on Gadsby's recent autism diagnosis. In the UK, the Duke of Burgundy butterfly is slowly emerging from near extinction, thanks in part to the owner of an organic dairy farm in Dorset. The large colony was discovered on the hills of the farm by an enthusiast and writer who summarised the habitable restoration, managerial conservation and population growth of the dark brown, orange peel-spotted insect, which took 20 years to increase its prospects of fertility. According to the British charity Butterfly Conservation, previous numbers had fallen to 46% in 2001, but has since grown to around 25% between 2010 and 2020. And lastly, in the US state of Maryland, a Good Samaritan rescued an 18-month-old girl from Assawoman Bay after she was ejected, still strapped to her car seat, from a silver pickup truck that crashed on the Route 90 bridge in Ocean City. Jonathan Bauer jumped over the guardrail to retrieve the infant, and cradled her in his arms before being transported back safely by another witness on a private boat. She was then flown to Johns Hopkins Hospital in a stable condition, but has since recovered. That's it for heaps good news for another week. Catch you all then.
Wavelength, sparking the convos about Adelaide you should be having on Fresh 92.7.
Thank you for that, Jared. Once again, always a pleasure to hear from you. Anyway, that brings us to the end of the show tonight. Thanks for listening, guys.
Make sure you're subscribed to the Wavelength podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else you get your podcast. You can listen back to our old episodes right now, and you'll be the first to know when tonight's episode goes up.
That's right. Thank you for joining me this week, Aj. We'll see you guys next Monday. You're listening to Fresh.
Wavelength.